And so the operations plan, if you recall, is the second principle of the project. So it lays out everything that we're going to do when it comes to flight operations. It's very similar to something in Department of Interior we call the Project Aviation Safety Plan. This does have safety in it, but it's really more, this is a little bit more robust. The operations plan is really just laying out like how we're going to conduct our flight operations. And so what we're looking at here is this is actually the operations plans for on-campus training flights for the UAS operations course, AES 2040, which is offered next spring, by the way. And so basically we put this together. I've had a little bit, just working with the class, I've had a little bit of feedback. We have seven students, and I have a teaching assistant in there as well. I've been sort of picking at this over the course of the semester and finally sort of wrapped it up yesterday. We actually had our first on-campus flights yesterday, which was kind of fun. And then as soon as we landed, we're doing our post-flight safety briefing and had a helicopter fly over at about 300 feet. So it was pretty cool. I was glad we were on the ground. I'm glad we were adhering to these standards. I don't know, the helicopter looked higher than that to me, but we checked it on flight radar 24. That helicopter was at 5,400 MSL, and I'm pretty sure the elevation on campus is like, it's right at 52. So we were trying to figure that out. But anyway, so let's just take a look at what's in the operations plan. All right, so these are all, if you look at the outline, that in the outline example I provided within the operations plan, this isn't an outline form. Like if I just scroll through it, you can see there's some text, like mostly like one-liners, some tables. There's the map of our operations, description of what all the map elements are, a table of our aircraft. You see, there isn't a ton of text in here, right? So these are like a checklist. Here's a flight briefing. So this is what, this is sort of like what we want to, everyone each day who's going to participate in the operations, we read through the flight briefing checklist, and here are the personnel that are going to participate in the flights. And so each of those individuals that are participating in the flight operations is going to sign, right, so that they have a little skin in the game. What this means is that the rules are laid out for everyone. Everyone understands what they are. And then if you violate some of those rules, well, I got your signature that says you were not going to, and then you went ahead and violated them. Now, one of the things we talked about yesterday is this operations plan. The reason we have to be a little more safety-minded is because there are a lot of people flying, right? We have, 10 people on this list, up to 9 people operating on site at a single time, so that does add some complexity. So depending on how your individual projects are, it might not be that you need to really have a signature block in your operations plan. But if you have more than one pilot, it's probably a good idea. And honestly, what I really want to do is I just had everyone pencil in the date here when they sign, but this should have a date column on it as well. Because by the way, this operations plan, if we look at the title of the plan, so it's AES 2040 Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems On-Campus Flight Training. All right, so the one site that's currently in here, this is our site behind 7th Street Classroom in the Elm Lot where we fly, but this is only one site. And the idea behind this operations plan is it can grow. We're trying to get access to be able to fly over the athletic fields. That would give us a little bit more room to stretch our little drone legs. And so I anticipate as we, or in 3040, the image analysis for UAS class, I want to produce a three-dimensional model of the Tivoli stack, right? So what I anticipate is over time that this operations plan will just include more sites, all right? And you can think about your project the same way, is that you're going to craft your operations plan to include, you know, all the safety provisions that you're going to need to fly wherever you need to fly. And then you can sort of plug in the sites, you know, just think of it as like a sort of a modular design where most of the information in here is regarding Auraria campus. But then there is some specific information to the site, and that's what this table 1 is here, the Elm Lot site attributes. All right, so just a couple things about the site. And so this is sort of like a location description. This really is something you could have for every single site. All right, so what else is in here? So aircraft and description. All we're really doing here is we're doing flight training, so we don't really have any complicated payloads. Where I would anticipate for some of your guys' projects, you might only have one aircraft, but then talk more specifically about the equipment. Where my equipment section is real brief, right? The only thing I talk about is some safety equipment that we're doing to mark our launching and landing zones. If this was a fire operation or like the water sampling mission or anything like that, I would definitely have a more extensive equipment list. But again, this is just stuff that's going to be on site in the field. So let's see. Let me just keep scrolling through. You guys can take a look. So risk assessment, and we haven't, I think I briefly talked about risk assessment here, but you can see what is going on is basically we worked through a risk assessment workbook, identified some aerial hazards, identified some ground hazards, used a risk assessment matrix to come up with a pre-mitigation risk. And then as a group, we worked together and derived some mitigating measures to reduce both the chances of these hazards becoming a risk and the severity of the hazards and causing damage should we encounter the hazard. So for, let's see, do I have, all right, so for example, I'll look at this, I'll just show you this last one. And you guys can do a risk assessment. I think I had you guys mention it and talk about it a little bit in your outlines, but I didn't officially have you work through a risk assessment. But so the way it worked is what I came up with was the biggest risk to operations on campus. There are two pretty big risks, and one of them is that St. Joseph's Hospital is pretty close. And so there's a Flight for Life helicopter that, and I think that's what that low-flying helicopter that went through our operating area was going to St. Joseph's. But there are a bunch of hospitals around Denver, and those Flight for Life helicopters stay pretty low. They launch, the rooftop launch. They stay pretty low and they travel throughout Denver along these set paths that are basically just A to B locations between the hospitals. There's one over here on the west side of Lakewood. That one goes over my house at about 400 feet all the time. So if I'll show you the map in a second, but so one of the concerns was the Flight for Life helicopter, but the big concern was, my big concern was someone's going to be flying their own drone It's going to go down in the street, and someone's going to run out in the street to grab their drone and get hit by a car, right? That's when I did the risk assessment, that was the biggest risk in my mind that actually came out of this, right? And that's why I said, well, so we worked together. I actually came up with these mitigating measures, but everyone else is turning in their mitigating measures today. But basically, so I said that is a really bad, it was a really bad risk. I think the chances of it were fairly, not likely, but not unlikely either, that someone's aircraft goes down in the street and they're not even thinking about traffic, right? They're like, my $1,000 piece of plastic is laying in the road. So without any mitigating measures, I thought this was a very risky thing to have happen. Like someone could really get jacked up, hit by a car, severely injured, potentially killed. All right, so what I came up with for mitigating measures is that we're going to use the age-old adage where we check both ways before we enter traffic. We're going to make eye contact with any drivers that are imminently going to collide with us. And then we're going to use our fellow crew members to help control traffic to make sure that a car doesn't just go after we're in the street. Right, and we're also wearing safety vests, which is a mitigating measure for all these things. So with those mitigating measures, I was able to reduce our risk, overall risk, to a 2. When we look at the bottom of this table, so the overall risk is the maximum risk of any of our factors. So the post-mitigation overall risk factor came up to be a 2, a medium risk. So I think our operations are at medium risk of causing injury or damage to anything for our on-campus operations. A little bit. I'm just trying to get you guys thinking about, what you can apply to these projects. So here are my flight execution scenarios, part of the outline. And really all I did, really for my flight execution scenarios, since this is a training flight, what we're actually accomplishing in each of the flights is laid out by, in the operations class, I have these assignments called competencies, and these are go, no-go. So these are things that you have to do with the aircraft, with the UAS. And so you have to accomplish all the tasks in the competencies to achieve success. All right. And so the specific flight scenarios are going to be laid out in the competencies. But what I did here is provided table 5, which basically, so what's in here is like, well, what checklists are going to be used for flight operations? What inspection tasks need to be completed for each flight? How many flights will be required to complete each objective? Is this going to be an automated or manual flights? What is the estimated time needed for each flight? And these are just summary answers because, as we'll see in Appendix C, the tasks that we're trying to accomplish on each flight are very specific. All right, and that's where I really am trying to get you guys to think about. In general, when students turn in these projects, they're all like pretty loose and ethereal, and it's not really clear about what exactly a flight would look like. And in my mind, that's where you guys are really going to start to understand what UAS is really like, right? The more you can visualize a single flight or a single operation, the more you're going to have an idea about what it's like. And when you go out and actually do a flight for the first time, I think you're going to be amazed at how well you actually understand what's happening because you've gone through the exercise of thinking about what these flights are going to look like. So here's the weather, environment, and timing area. And so again, I'm just talking about weather, environment, and timing elements that are specific to this operations plan. Weather is going to be pretty standard. And this is a statement that should probably be in everyone's operations plan. So, you know, unless you have some specialty aircraft, there's no reason to think that you're ever going to operate in precipitation if it's colder than 32 degrees or if the winds exceed 25 knots. If you guys have looked at the aircraft that you've selected for your projects, have dug into the manufacturer's specs, my guess is most commercial off-the-shelf aircraft are going to fall under these standard guidelines. All DJI aircraft other than the M200 series, so the 200, the 210, and the 300 all have the ability, I think, I'm not sure about the 200, but the 210, I think they tout can operate in some precipitation. And I think the 210 can also operate in some heavier winds, but this should just be guided by the aircraft. But these are pretty standard things in the field. All right, so what environmental variables are related to this operations plan? So we're dealing with an urban environment. So some of our challenges include seen and unseen hazards. All right, so since we're in an urban environment on a campus, flying on campus, where curiosity is why people are here, right? People are honorary campus because they want to learn something, right? So therefore, you're automatically going to get curious people seeing you fly drones. So that's just something we need to be aware of. It's a very obvious thing. So we also want to be aware of non-intuitive wind patterns, all right, from the environment. We have buildings and structures. We're flying right next to a parking garage. Wind can go through those garages and do crazy things. So we just want to be aware of non-intuitive wind patterns. Right. Next thing to be aware of, electromagnetic radiations. And so this is one of those not unseen things that depending on your aircraft, if you're flying near cell phone towers, they can cause interference between the GCS and the aircraft and cause a loss of link, right? So things we have to be aware of. So we want to try to identify cell towers, their radio antennas, other things that can cause radiometric radiation interference. Electromagnetic radiation interference. Radiometrics for a different class. All right. So operating in Colorado, high density altitude. I'm sure you guys have talked about that in your other aviation classes. A lot of drones will send you a set of regular props and then high performance props. And typically the cutoff for high performance is right around 5,000 feet. And that's density altitude. So, you know, typically Colorado, like I fly regular props until it gets, you know, 70 degrees or warmer because the air is really thin here. And, you know, as soon as that air temperature starts heating up around here, we have to worry about density altitude. So that's a big one for this operations plan. And then Part 107 rules dictate that we may not operate a UAS within 3 nautical miles of, I didn't finish my sentence here, but of IFR conditions. So instrument flight rule conditions, right? So if there's a cloud, we're operating in a cloud, we can't do that. We can't even operate within 3 miles of a cloud or fog. Anything that's going to obscure our vision out to 3 miles. All right, then timing. We really didn't have much with timing because this is training, right? So with timing, the only timing restriction we have is being following the 107 rules, which actually just changed to allow night flights if you have the proper navigation lights. but we have to worry about civil twilight and that transition period between day and nighttime flights. So that's really the only timing. Really, timing is for thinking about scientific missions or thinking about coordinated missions. So scientific missions, with timing, we have to, if we're collecting imagery, we want that our flights to correspond with like the solar noon so that we have good light on whatever data we're collecting or whatever ground targets we're collecting data for. Or we could also think about timing if we're like, for example, if we're doing a vegetation survey or an animal survey, we want to fly when that vegetation maybe is blooming so we get a picture of the flowers, or we want to fly when wildlife is going to be in the area, right? So maybe we're looking at sage grouse nesting, or what the hell are those things called? A group of sage grouse. I used to know. Brood. I think they're called broods, and so the sage grouse are only active in the brood sites at certain times a year. So that's the sort of time. That's what the timing element is supposed to mean. With training flights, we don't really care. We're just trying to get our fingers working the sticks and controlling the aircraft. Right, travel and logistics works a lot different for this environment, but I gave you guys some examples for your for the outline. And then airspace and policy. You know, what are we looking at here? We are, you know, the big thing for flying on campus is we had to get approval from the campus police and from they're event services. So it's all AHEC. It's got nothing to do with MSU per se. This is all run by the Auraria Higher Education Center folks. So local policy, you know, we're going to stay 300 feet and below, right? And what is Part 107? Part 107 allows us to fly up to 400 feet. But I've just seen those, you know, and I assume that the Flight for Life helicopters are going to stay 400 and above. And it looked to me like that helicopter was at least 500 or 600 feet, but maybe not. And so I said our policy as a class is going to be to stay 300 feet and below. Right, and that's my policy. That's our local policy. So just an example of how, you know, you can set some more restricted policies. The idea is if we hit a manned aircraft or lose control of the aircraft and have a flyaway, this gives us a little bit more of a buffer. If any of those things happen, the project's over, right? And it's all about project success. It isn't just safety for safety's sake. That is a big reason to exercise safety, but ultimately what we want to do is make sure that our project is going to be successful. And then the big local thing is that prior to doing any flights in the afternoon, I call dispatch, AHEC PD, and then when we're done for the day, I call them again and let them know we're done for the day. So on campus for education, I lay out what rules for the FAA we're flying. So we can fly under the recreational flyers and modeler community-based organizations rules. But all those rules say is that, you know, you have to follow Part 107, the commercial operations rules, and you are liable for those. So really what it boils down to is we're just operating under 107, though officially we're operating as hobbyists. So what that means, the big thing it means is that we don't actually have to have a 107 certification to operate in an educational environment. Still working out insurance and So training and long-term planning, this is training, right? So I didn't have anything in here for training or long-term planning. This would be where this section's more important is if this operations plan is laying out sort of long-term objectives. So if this was an operations plan that just sort of talked about, vegetation surveys for the next year, right? So here's where I'd want to lay out some specific goals that I want to accomplish over that year and how we want to increase our proficiency as a flight crew with each of those flights. But this is a training, so there is really the only plan here is that you show up and do the flights. So budget, we didn't have a budget at all for the training. Everyone is already scheduled to show up to class. We're flying at class, so we don't really need a transportation budget. I'm handling all the aircraft, or individuals are handling their own aircraft, so there's no budget to be had for this particular operation. Right, and then so Appendix A, I have the agreement between the area campus and me, so I filled all this stuff out and I had to send it out, and it was signed by Angela Levely, who's with Campus Event Services. But this went to AHEC PD. They didn't sign it. I don't know why, but they ultimately gave Angela the authority to sign it and send it back to me. But what I'm probably going to do, I had just finished this operations plan yesterday, like I said. I'm going to send the operations plan to AHEC PD so they can put it on their file. And I'll probably point out that they didn't sign it, and I'll try to get a signature in there. Right, Appendix B, so this is the overall map, and this is Auraria campus. So this is St. Joe's. Now I'm wondering, actually now that I'm looking at this map, and I bet that's exactly where they were going. That flight went like this. So you see St. Joe's is right there, and that helicopter flew right over. Anyway, this map is here so that we see where the emergency rooms are, okay? If we're flying on campus, anyone slices a finger open or gets hit by a car, we can, we do triage, we make a decision whether or not we can mobilize someone. Do we just call 911, or is it faster to throw someone in a car and take them over to the hospital? All right, then Appendix C. So I did want to show you this because these are the specific objectives of Competency 4. So these are all the things that students must complete to receive credit for Competency 4. All right, so they're not all flight related. So participate in the mission safety briefing, conduct a pre-flight inspection of the aircraft prior to the flight, conduct a pre-flight briefing to fellow students prior to flight, use the launch recovery checklist with your visual observer using command and response to conduct a flight. Safely launch and land the UAS 3 times, so we're just doing 3 launches and landings, so that's the first sort of flight operation. Identify remote control and aircraft battery percent, and some other telemetry. After launch, you're going to do surface checks, making sure that your GCS is working properly. And then the only flight exercise is basically there are 3. You're going to do a box pattern following instructions from your coach. Conduct a figure 8, which is basically 2 controlled turns, stuff we've been doing the whole semester. And then we're going to do a corkscrew where we conduct a controlled turn and gain and lose some elevation. Right, so those are the specific flight objectives of so far that's in this operations plan, right? So over time, Competency 5 is going to go in here, Competency 6 is going to go in here. And much of this will stay the same. What'll change is that every time this operations plan changes, that we'll talk about what the changes are, and then everyone will sign this for each day's operations. And then what I'll probably do is I'm just going to print page 4, just so you guys have an idea, like where the rubber meets the road. This is how things are going to go. I will just print page 4. We'll all sign this, and then I'll just replace page 4 in the operations plan. I don't need to print the whole plan again. And then maybe I'll just print the Appendix C. Hopefully this is helpful. Does anyone have any questions about the operations plan? And where I think this is helpful for understanding what goes in the introduction is this is very different from the introduction. All right, so the introduction should talk about the operations plan, but the introduction is going to go sort of at the front of your project plan, and should really incorporate your project definitions. And really, the project definition is really right here in this project description. See, it's very succinct, very short. And